me have a brief introduction. Good morning, everyone. So today, welcome all to this very first seminar in 2021, and hopefully everyone stays safe. So now let me just give a brief introduction for Dr. Cyril Karen. So Dr. Cyril Karen is a senior scientist at the Laboratory of Thermomechanical Metallurgy at EPFL, Switzerland. So he is an expert in using TEM, SEM, and EBSD, and he has a broad interest in metallurgy, crystallography, and microscopy. So his current research is about the crystallography of martensite transformations and deformation training in metals and minerals. And today, his talk will be on what EBSD and TKD tell us about the twins. So now, let's welcome Dr. Karen to start his presentation.
Thank you, Jiang, for having me, and thank you for the invitation. So I think I will need a little more than half an hour, probably 40 minutes. It's 30 slides. It's a broad overview of my research on martensitic transformation, twins, on how to use electron backscatter diffraction and transmission Kikuchi diffraction to study the crystallography of twins. So I will first try to define the twins. I will speak about martensite. I will use some examples as martensite in steels, because you can consider that martensite is a kind of twins in general meaning. And I will use this example to start my doubts about the classical theory of martensitic transformation. And I will try to explain you why I have some reservations on these theories. And what we can do as alternatives of these theories. Then I will try to speak quite quickly also about some twins in magnesiums. I will not have time to speak about twins in minerals on rocks, even if it's very interesting, but I need to make some selection. And I will try also at the end of the session to speak about nitinol, nickel titanium alloys, shape memory alloys. And my main conclusion, I can already tell you that my main conclusion is to tell you that, to my point of view, you cannot consider twins or martensitic transformation as a result of a simple shears, as it is usually written in books, in textbooks. It's a little more complex than that, and we need not a shear distortion, but a broader kind of distortion that I call angular distortion. So I will try to go quite quickly. First, I think that all of you know what, of course, in your laboratory, what is EBSD and TKD. So I will just go very fast here. In EBSD, you need to polished bulk samples orientated to collect the Kikuchi patterns to get the orientation on the face of each grains or each pixels under the electron beams. And in TKD, it's transmission Kikuchi diffraction, you use a thin TM lamella to increase the resolution. Well, it's a slight increase, but I will show you that it can be significant. And it's even more significant with the recent introduction of the CMOS cameras in EBSD, because you can collect, the dynamics is better, so you can collect images, orientation images by TKD on a wide range of thickness in your TM lamella. And also, I also noticed a very big improvement of the algorithm to index the Kikuchi patterns. Even if you don't know where is the pattern center, you don't care anymore. And in TKD, it's very helpful because you don't know, you do not have to calibrate exactly where is your sample in reference to where is your camera. You just need to put your sample very close to the pole piece of your scanning microscope and to collect the maximum of Kikuchi patterns with the best signal. And with the commercial software, it's sufficient. So actually, you can do EBSD on TKD even without knowing all the details of these techniques. And it's my case, actually. So let me now define what I call twins. It's a very, very broad term that can be sometimes confusing. So if I take the very large definition of what is a twin is a specific, by specific I mean non-random misorientation between two grains or two crystals of the same phase. And crystallographers call that a twin law. This law is often a rotation of 180 degrees around a crystallographic direction, or it can be also a mirror symmetry through crystallographic plane. And you can look in this definition. It's only about misorientation. There is no notion of what is the interface, what is the composition plane. It's only based on the misorientation. So now in metallurgy, we can apply these definitions to different types of twins. The growth twins that are formed during solidification, during liquid to solid transformation. The solid can appear with some defects. And these non-random defects are actually the twins. Or they can also appear during recrystallization on grain growth. And in that case, also during grain growth, some accident can happen. But because of the low stacking fault energy, it's not random because you have the low stacking. Okay, so when it is random, the distribution of grains, the misorientation between the grains should follow more or less the Mackenzie curve that is here. And this Mackenzie curve is completely, you can compute it. You take two cubic grains randomly orientated, and you calculate, you take into account the symmetries of the cubic symmetries, and you will realize that actually the distribution of rotation angles is not homogeneous. It follows this curve, Mackenzie. And you will also notice that you cannot go up to 62 or 63 degrees if by the symmetries, for example, if you find an angle of 70 degrees, you can reduce it by the symmetry, cubic symmetries, to a lower rotation angle, equivalent angle. That's why the curve stop at 62 degrees, something like that. So you have to compare what is your experimental distribution of misorientation with Mackenzie curve. And here, for example, in this example, on the left side, it follows very well Mackenzie curve. It means that the grains are randomly orientated. So it means that there is no twins, nothing special, and to me, there is no coincident C-lattice, CSL. That's why it's surprising, because I took this image from a paper in which the title was Grain Boundary Interconnection of Sigma 5. On Sigma 5, it is a kind of twins. That was surprising that they wanted to study Sigma 5 in this alloy that does not contain Sigma 5 if you look at the misorientation distribution. But anyway, okay, let's go. At the contrary, if you look at the right side of the slide, it's a magnesium alloy, a single crystal, in which I could form twins during cutting. Actually, when I cut the sample, I form the twins. And if you look at the misorientation, the histogram of misorientation between the grains, well, here it's very clear. You see peaks at 48, peaks at 58 degrees, and one peak at 86. So it's completely non-random. You form specific misorientation, and that's what we call twins. Well, I think I will skip a lot of slides because I was delayed, but anyway, I came back to study not twins, but martensite in steels, because initially, maybe 15 years ago, I wanted to reconstruct the prior austenite grains from the martensitic microstructure. So I developed a computer program, maybe you know it, it's called ARPG, for austenitic reconstruction of parent grain acquired in EBSD. And on the left picture, you see the martensitic microstructure, fully martensitic, It's an EBSD map. On the right side, you see after reconstruction, you see the prior austenitic grains. It's the austenite that was existing at high temperature, and then that disappeared to be transformed into martensite at low temperature. Anyway, what was of interest to me is also that if you look inside the prior austenitic grains, and you look at the orientation of the martensite, we know in stills that there is 24 variants of martensite. So we could expect to get 24 discrete features in the pole figures. So I plot the pole figure on the right, sorry, they are represented in blue, the experimental pole figure of the variants. And instead of getting discrete spots that were coming from the 24 variants, I obtained like a continuous features. I don't see if you see like a threefold flowers and a little cross. I don't know if you see them, but if you add only 24 variants, you would not get these nice continuous features in the pole figures. So everything started by this simple question: how can I explain these continuous features in the pole figure of martensite? I look at literature at that time, and there were a theory that is called the phenomenological theory of martensitic crystallography. It is based on the fact that if you look at FCC, phase center cubic phase, how to transform a FCC into BCC, into body center cubic phase. If you look on the left part, Bain distortion, there is a cube that is represented alone. It's a FCC. When you put two cubes of FCC side by side, and you look at the cell that is in the middle, it's with the vectors B1, B2, B3. It is a tetragonal center cell. Well, Bain had this marvelous idea to tell, look at this cell, center cell. You just have to contract one axis, the B3 axis, you contract it, and you extend the B1 and B2 axis to get a BCC structure. So this transformation is called Bain distortion, and it is actually more specifically a stretch distortion. Okay, but if you look at the Bain schematic representation, just at the Bain distortion, that is, you can use a matrix B to represent it, this distortion. Well, it's not what you observe experimentally. We observe an orientation relationship that is not B, but is B composed with a rotation of around 10 degrees. So that's one point. And the other point is that we know from the shape that the shape is like a plate or a lenticle with an invariant, well, people think an invariant plane in the middle of the lenticle. So they assume that it was the distortion should be actually a simple shear, but since there is also a change of volume, it's a composition of simple shear and an extension perpendicular to the simple shear. So they have to introduce this P1, a matrix that is an invariant plane strain that is a simple shear composed with a volume change. But it's not enough, because if you just put a simple shear, you cannot make the equality with RB. So you need to add another shear that is called P2, and to tell that, okay, this P2, it's another simple shear that represents stacking of dislocation or mechanical twinning inside the martensite and so on. Well, anyway, this is more or less the spirit of this PTMC, phenomenological theory of martensite crystallography. And one of the best promoters of this theory is, I'm sure you know him, is Professor Badeshia at Cambridge University. So it's very mathematically, it's very rigorous. There is no problem with that. But the problem is that it's difficult to imagine how the atom could move if you look at this equation. There is also another theory that is a little different from PTMC, that considers that it's impossible to do simple shear immediately. You know, it's this famous in all textbooks, when you see an introduction to dislocations, it's always start by telling that it's impossible to apply a simple shear or to shear a plane directly, because if you look at the atoms, energetically it will be the energy you need will be too much. So it will be easier to leave a dislocation, make a first small step, then another dislocation, and so on. So they imagine that for Martensite or for deformation twinning, it was the same, that you need dislocation to produce the Martensite or a twin. So in this theory, that is called disconnection, or because it's sometimes you need very specific kind of dislocation to readjust the position of the atoms. So in this disconnection model, they assume that the Martensite or the twins, the reorientation, is the result of movements of dislocation, specific dislocations. So I try to represent this situation on the right part, where you see dislocation. Here it's edge dislocation that goes from the left to the right. And if they are stacked in a specific order, and if their Burger's vector is also specific, you can, with this model, transform a FCC, for example, into BCC, or FCC into HCP, with partial Shockley dislocation, for example. But there, I was not also very happy with that, because you have a lot of questions. Where does this dislocation come from? How they are created? How can they move collectively and in a coordinate way to build this new phase? And how can they move at the speed of sound? Because we know that twins, mechanical twins, can on Martensite also can go at the speed of sound. So it was difficult for me to imagine dislocation coming from nowhere and creating exactly what you wanted, a Martensite or a twin. But anyway, there are schools even today that promotes this disconnection model. Actually, I came back to my initial problem. I wanted to explain this continuous rotation, and I also wanted to get a better idea of how the atom move during a phase transformation. So I just make it as simple as I could. I said, okay, let's consider in a metal that the atoms are as hard spheres, more or less. In magnesium, for example, the C on A ratio is 1.62. That is close to the ideal one you could expect by stacking hard spheres. So if you look at the left image, it's a stacking of balls with an hexagonal order. And if you look at the right, you see a square lattice form, and how you go from the left to the right. This is a phase transformation. How you can go, you can make this transformation. If you look at what PTMC says, it says that if you look this square Martensitic transformation with PTMC, they imagine two ways, one with a stretch and a rotation, and another way that is a shear with a dilatation. And the theory tells you that both paths lead to the same final structure and same final orientation. That's good, but in between, what happens? Do we follow the way that is on the top, on the way, or the way that is at the bottom? I mean, the atoms are not schizophrenic. They must choose one way. And PTMC tells nothing about what happens in between the beginning and between the from the beginning to the end. So if you just look at these two images, you can tell, no, the atom rolls, and let's look how they could move. It's not as complicated as PTMC tells. And it's what I try to say at the right here, where you just imaging that you move the atoms. I had a movie to show, but you can imagine you just let roll the atoms, and you can do math. You can calculate a distortion matrix that depends on the angles that are called beta here, and you just change the angle beta, and you go continuously from the left to the right, from the hexagonal stacking to the square stacking, without any difficulties, actually. You can do that for FCC to BCC. You can do the same calculation. It's well, okay, it can be complex, but from the principle, it's not difficult to understand. So you can make a movie of what is a Bain distortion, or what is the same distortion composed with the rotation, which gives you the final Kurdyumov-Sachs orientation relationship if you need. So you can do a lot of calculation. Well, here it's an example, for example, of the calculation to transform a FCC, phase center cubic, to BCC continuously, just with one parameter, which is an angle beta. Well, actually, you take the cosinus of beta, that I call x, and you can go continuously from FCC to BCC. You can calculate the distortion matrix for that. I will skip the details, but it's just to tell that you can do calculation. You can do also, it helps you to make some links between, for example, the FCC to BCC transformation. If you see FCC, it's at the left, and BCC is at the bottom in orange. And if you look, it's what is represented. You know, it's the ABC stacking. You know that on the 1-1-1 plane, you can represent FCC by a stacking ABC. Well, if you look at the first layer on the second layer, I represented an atom M in the second layer. And if you just look, you move just the atoms without changing the layer, you create a twin. You change the stacking ABC into ACB. But if you look at the orange representation, it means that you change the position of the atoms exactly as twinning, but at the same time you open the angles in the 1-1-1 plane. The 60 degrees angle in the 1-1 plane, you open it to 70 degrees at the same time. You move the atoms. Then what you have, it's exactly the FCC to BCC transformation. And okay, you can calculate, for example, how the atoms move perpendicularly to the 1-1-1 plane. You can do a lot of calculation with that. And here, what was represented here was a movie. I think it was important, but it was a movie to explain how I could transform as a wave. The idea was to show that deformation twinning or Martensite, it's better to represent that as a wave of transformation. So here I had a movie, but I will not show you. Here it's the result of the movie. You start imagining that at the beginning you had an hexagonal stacking, and here in the middle, you see in the middle you have a cubic stacking. And you can change continuously. So to me, it's like as if you were with an hexagonal stacking everywhere, and you start forming a Martensite of a square lattice in the core of the grain. And what is in between is the accommodation between your hexagonal lattice and your square lattice. And look, there is no dislocation here. Everything is continuous and elastic. It means that you can introduce a continuous rotation field to adapt the incompatibilities between your martensite, here it's a square martensite, and the surrounding grain, that is here it's the austenite, that is here hexagonal. Here it's more another type of representation to show you that you can, this continuous rotation is necessary to accommodate the martensite with the surrounding parent austenite. And that's exactly what I noticed. My first question, these continuous features in the martensite, while to me, the explanation is here. So that was quite satisfying to know that you can take an atomistic model to explain something that is more mesoscopic, that is the continuous rotation field observed by EBSD. So here it's just to tell you that here it's the experimental pole figure of martensite, and here it's a simulation with the 24 variants and with the continuous rotation A and B. And this continuous rotation fits well with the experiments. And this continuous rotation are actually two important components of the distortion matrix that I could calculate with these simple models made on art spheres. Some of you may have some question, but what about the surface relief? We know that people were thinking that it was a simple shear because of this type of relief at the surface. While even if it's an angular distortion, you can explain this relief. You don't need to assume that it should be specifically a simple shear. And also, if I come back to this question, how can we explain that you can form twins or martensite? There is always this question that we need dislocation, that it's impossible energetically to form a shear immediately, instantaneously, and that we need dislocation. And I said, yes, I fully agree with the fact that we need dislocation, but it does not mean that the dislocation are the cause of the transformation. To me, they are the consequence of the transformation. So when people show some dislocation at the tip of a martensite or at the tip of a twin, and that tells that these dislocations have created the martensite itself, I said, no, I disagree. To me, it's the martensite or the twin that has created the dislocation. So it's, to me, you have to reverse the classical way of thinking things when we use dislocation. And the good things is that we can with this, by changing this way of thinking, we can now look at many different problems. For example, if I look at extension twins in magnesium, here it's an EBSD map. You see with this red grain boundaries are actually the boundaries of representing 86 misorientation rotation around the A-axis, I think. So if you look at these twins, you can make exactly the same thing. You can to look at the atoms in the HCP structure of magnesium and look how you can transform. Look after twinning where are the atoms, and make a continuous path between the two structures. And then you realize that actually, if you look at the details, you realize that what is called the shear plane cannot be actually a shear plane, because if you look at some distances, some direction in this plane, they are not constant. They change during the twinning mechanism. When you change the basal plane at the left on the top, I'm sorry, the laser is really missing to me, but when you change basal into prismatic and prismatic into basal plane by this type of twinning, and you look at this 1, 0, minus 1, 2 plane, that is is supposed to be the invariant plane, the shear plane. If you look at the atoms inside this plane, you will realize that it cannot be fully invariant during the transformation. Some distance change, and then they come back to their initial length. It means that it's not fully invariant. It means that in the detail, in the mechanism itself, twinning cannot be a simple shearing. Well, here I had a movie also, but I cannot show you. What is also interesting is that if you look at the movie, or if you imagine what happens during the start, between the start and the end of the deformation twinning, extension twinning, you will also realize that there is a change of volume in between. It means that, okay, the volume at the end is the same than the volume at the beginning, but in between, there is a slight increase of volume. And you can say, okay, well, instead of calculating the Schmidt factor to determine when the twin will be formed, I will say, no, the condition to form the twin is not the Schmidt factor, but it's the condition to reach the maximum of volume change, because it's like the gap you must cross. And if you do that, you can calculate when, in which, imagine that you take a single crystal of magnesium, and you use two angles to say how it is orientated in your mechanical test. And here it's a tensile test. And you say, okay, when it is orientated well to produce the twins, so it is here it's written in with red colors, and when it is not well orientated, so it is in blue. If you do the calculation assuming a simple shear, you get the image that is on the left. But if you do the calculation with a distortion matrix, you could calculate with the hard sphere, and you replace the Schmidt criteria by this when you can reach the maximum of volume change. Look, there are some differences between the two predictions. And what is nice is that with a simple shear, you predict that you form twins between minus 43 and 47 degrees. But with this hard sphere model, you predict that you can form twins between minus 58 and plus 58. And I don't know if it's by chance, but there is an experimental study that reports exactly this angle of 58 degrees. Okay, I know that I was too long, so I will skip this part. I will just try to finish. If you leave me 10 minutes more, I would like to speak a little about shape memory alloys.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Okay, so 10 minutes for that. If you look at textbooks on shape memory alloys, you will always find this schematic view that is on the top right corner here. There is a representation of austenite. If you cool, you form different variants of martensite. If you deform at a low temperature, you will reorient the variants of martensite to get only one variant. Okay, and if you heat again, you will reform the initial orientation of austenite, which means that you will come back to the initial shape of your shape memory alloys. So that's a very classical way to represent the link between what happened to the external macroscopic shape of your shape memory alloys and what happens at the crystallographic point of view at the atomic scale level. There is really a link between what happens at the atom scale and what happens at the macroscopic scale. So this is a nice representation. Unfortunately, if you look at the experimental proof of that, well, I was very surprised, but you will not find any EBSD proof of that. Whereas EBSD would be the perfect tool to illustrate this schematic representation. So I do not tell that this representation is not good. I just tell that it could be good to improve its reliability by experiments. And for decades and decades, what people used is TEM. They use TEM to show martensite as the image on the right. But by TEM, you just look at a small area. You cannot study a lot of grains, and the indexation is it's difficult. If you have to do to index during a TEM session, okay, you can index 10 grains. You have to tilt your samples. You have to find the good orientation. It's really a hard work. So to make some statistics, it's really not good. And the second point is that, to me, is that the theory to explain shape memory alloys is, again, the PTMC, the phenomenological theory of martensitic crystallography. And I told you what I think about this theory. So all these two things together pushed me to try to study nitinol quite recently, last year, for example. So what I did, I electropolished a nitinol alloy that I buy it for maybe 10 pounds on internet. I just polish it, and I could make a map here on the first line on the right. You see a map of the monoclinic phase, that is B90 prime phase. That is the martensite in the nitinol alloy. On the left, in blue and yellow, it's the phase map, where you see in blue that there are some retained B2 parent phase. In the second line, you have two images. I will skip them. It's just to tell you that I was able to reconstruct the full B2 grains, also by using the same software, but it's not of interest here. What is of interest is that at the bottom, you see these misorientation histograms. So you see that it's not random. You can call them twins. Well, it's actually variants, but you can call them twins. And in addition to the misorientation angle, you can also plot the misorientation axis corresponding to the misorientation angles. And you see that they are very specific. They are not randomly oriented. They are not distributed everywhere in the pole figures. So my question is, can we understand this histogram of misorientation? So first of all, you need to identify what is the orientation relationship between your cubic phase parent, the B2 phase, and the monoclinic phase, the martensite. So here, I was lucky because there is some retained B2 phase. So you look at the pole figures of B2, of B19 prime phase, you look at the low index directions or planes, and you try to establish when there is a parallelism of the directions. And if you do that, it's quite fastidious, but if you do that, you realize that there is not a unique orientation relationship, but many of them. And if you took all of them into account, you can reproduce quite nicely the misorientation histograms. So on the top, it's the experiments, and at the bottom, it's the simulation. So the position in the histograms are good, the angles are good, and also the rotation axis also, are also in the good position. So it's a confirmation that contrarily to what is said, you do not have only one orientation relationship, but you have a continuum of orientation relationship. So it's exactly as for martensite. You do not have only, you have a continuum, gradient of orientation. Then I look at what was the main orientation relationship, because there is one that is more important than the other. Statistically, and it was a rotation that I called A, or it's also close to AQ. AQ is in red. It's to me it was a natural orientation because it's established a parallelism between the dance plane and dance directions of the daughter and parent phases. It's exactly as the Kurdyumov-Sachs orientation in Stills. Kurdyumov-Sachs established a parallelism between the dance plane and dance direction. So here it was the same. So this orientation, even if we have many orientation relationships, this orientation AQ as it's special to me. I just skip this slide to tell you that you can do from this orientation and from the correspondence matrix, you can calculate the distortion matrix corresponding to the transformation from B2 to B90 prime. It's what is it's with a F, FA B2. It's the distortion matrix. But you can calculate this distortion matrix for the different orientation relationship we found. And if I want to predict the habit plane, I said, okay, the habit plane, I mean the plane between martensite and austenite should be unrotated by this distortion matrix. So it should be an eigenvectors of the reciprocal, well, of this matrix taken in the reciprocal space. And here in bold, I don't know if you can see, there is a 1, -1, 2. So it is one habit plane predicted by the calculation. And I finish with that, just to tell you that if I plot these predicted habit planes on the EBSD map, you see that it fits quite well with the experimental morphologies of the martensite. Yeah, in the title there was the word TKD. It's also to tell you that in the previous EBSD we do not see the fine structure. We see the martensite, but we do not see what is called the twins inside the twins. We do not see the twins inside the martensite, whereas we know from TEM that they exist. And if you use the same sample and you do TKD on it, then we see the twins inside the twins. So TKD is really a very good complementary to EBSD to look at the finer structure inside the martensite. Oh, yeah. So it just more or less, it's my last slide. To give you a broad overview of the twins also on more martensite, I would tell that to me, the message is that martensite or twinning is not a simple shear. If you look at the movie, I would say, of what happened between the between the beginning and the end. Okay, and then if you look at the atoms and you consider them as hard sphere, at least in steels and magnesium, you can do that. You can calculate the distortion matrix. And there is, to me, one that is important, that the distortion matrix corresponding to the natural orientation relationship. And if you have this, if you take only this one orientation relationship, here with this example with the square and the parallelograms, you get only finite numbers of variants. But we know from EBSD, we know that there is a gradient of orientation between these variants. And this gradient of orientation between these variants create additional orientation relationship and create a continuum of orientation relationship. And they are due to the fact that you need to accommodate the incompatibilities. And here it's a way in this representation on the right. It's just to explain how you can figure out how to make this accommodation. You look at one direction that is a mirror symmetry, for example, of the parent phase, and it is transformed into two different planes, and then you close the gap to come back to make a parallelism between these planes. But I think I have it's more or less the idea, and I will not enter too much in the details. So that's my conclusion, that it's possible just from EBSD to make some atomistic models, and you are pushed to rethink I think the theory, because the classical theory in textbooks does not fit, and to me cannot explain the experiments. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Karen. That was very nice work.
And without the laser, it was difficult for me. Laser beam, laser pointer is helpful, but anyway.
But I think it's still very nice, like those schematics with your explanation do make a lot of sense already. But just in case anyone has any problem, no problem. Has any questions? I'm sorry. Any questions? Please ask. And so, can I start with one? You were mentioning about the 1/1,2. So that's some special planes that you think is the main orientation relationship.
With in what? Sorry, in what?
In the monoclinic phase.
In what? Sorry.
In the monoclinic phase.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here? Yes. Yes. The 1 - 1, 2.
Yeah, 1 - 1, 2. So you said if you choose to show that pole figures, is it better? Is it tighter? The pole figures.
I did not plot the pole figures here. Here it's this plane refers to the indices. The Miller indices here are given in the B2 reference. It means that it's 1 - 1, 2 plane in B2. Then you have to transform them into the B90 prime, into the monoclinic phase.
Yeah.
So if you do that in the monoclinic phase, they are actually the plane 1, 0, - 1.
Okay, 1, 0, - 1.
Well, yes. So I should plot the pole figures should be plot on the 1, 0, - 1.
Yeah.
And what if you see the black lines are the traces of the 1, 0, - 1. It means that they are perpendicular to in the pole figure, because if I plot the pole figures and I plot the 1, 0, - 1 plane, then I make a line that is perpendicular to these poles, and it gives you these black lines.
Yeah, the trace line.
It's the trace of the habit planes you expect. Well, I expect.
Okay.
It means that, just to make it simple, I made some calculations. I said, okay, according to my calculation, I predict 1 - 1, 2 habit plane in the B2 in the parent phase, which should be a 1, 0, - 1 B90 prime habit plane. So I look at the traces of these planes. And then I look if it fits or not with the morphology.
It fits better to the morphology.
And it fits, to me, it fits quite well.
Okay.
It's not perfect, but it fits quite well. I mean, the black lines are more or less parallel to the morphology.
Okay. So, if we see this, compare the experimental data, so by looking at the trace of these specific planes, this fits better with the angulation distortion theory, right?
Yeah, if I do the same job with a PTMC, PTMC first, you can get different results. It depends on the way and the assumption in your PTMC. It also depends on the lattice parameters. It depends on many things. But if I took the best in literature about what was predicted by PTMC, it was another plane with, I mean, the indices are awful. It's real numbers. I do not remember the numbers, but it's large numbers. And if I plot the traces of the habit planes predicted by PTMC, they do not fit as good as here. I could show you they are not so far. They are 10 degrees from what is plotted here.
Yeah.
But they are not as good as what I obtained here.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Yeah. So like the scattering in your experimental data, in experimental data, can be better explained using your proposed theory, right?
Well, to me, yes. To me, first, I can explain the habit plane, which is important in any crystallographic theory of Mortensite. You need to explain the habit planes. So I think it's done here. Secondly, I wanted to explain the fact that I have many orientation relationships, not one. I have, and actually there is a continuum of orientation. They look all different. If you look at the A, C, A, Q, C, these orientation relationships look very different. But actually, if you plot them in a pole figure, if you plot all the variants created by this orientation relationship, they are not so far from each other. They are quite close. And there is a continuum between them. So I wanted to explain this continuum of orientation between this orientation relationship. And I did not finish the job, I must say, but at least I was able to reproduce the misorientation histograms. And at the end, I got a better idea of why do we have a continuum of orientation relationship. It's because we need to close. If you look at the square, from a square, I can form with a specific orientation relationship, I can form 4 parallelograms in a range. But yeah, without the laser beam, it's not obvious to explain. But look at the variant alpha 1 and alpha 3 on the left and on the right. Do you see these 2 parallelograms, horizontal, alpha 1 and alpha 3?
Yeah.
Look at the vector B alpha.
Yeah.
Then initially this vector was a vertical line belonging to the austenite. But for one variant, it was transformed to B at the right, and for the other variant 3, it was transformed to B at the left. Yeah. But initially, it was the same direction. It means that this direction in one variant is tilted to the left, and in another variant is tilted to the right. But I imagine that there is no incompatibilities. I need an elastic or plastic, but I need a field to make a continuum between these 2 B vectors.
Yeah.
And it's what is represented in the image in the figure B here.
Yeah.
You see, in figure B, it's the continuum I need to put the B alpha vector in contact. This gives you a new orientation relationship, and this gives you a continuum of orientation relationship. And that's exactly what it's what I could observe by EBSD anti-KD on nitinol alloys. But it's quite general, actually. It's the same thing in steels. And even if you look at twinning, deformation twinning in magnesium, if you look at the pole figures, you will see that you have not a point in the pole figure, but you have tiny lines, tiny arc of circles. Yeah. And these tiny arcs of circles are exactly due to this effect, that you need to accommodate the orientation between the parent and the daughter.
Yeah, I see. I totally understand. Yeah, what you mean now. Yes. So because for the scattering of the EBSD raw data, they are not like randomly scattered. You mean like sometimes there is an arc of circle that you can see. And it also happens to some of our research in our group as well. So we could see some of those sometimes. Yes.
So it's exactly that. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly
okay.
What I want.
So I think Song raised his hand. So please, Song.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jingwei, and thank you very much, Dr. Karen, for a very nice presentation. So I have following up question about the continuation of rotation. So does it result in the gradient of dislocation? Because we have like a gradient of, have a continuum rotation of atoms. It tends to result to kind of like a lattice strain, and that requires kind of necessary dislocation to accommodate that rotation. And if that's the case, do you see that in the EBSD mapping? Because when we do EBSD, we tend to see kind of this, kind of gradient of dislocation pattern, necessary dislocations. So that is kind of two following up questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, of course, in EBSD, we do not see individual dislocations. We see we see their effect on mesoscopic effect. So we see like specific stacking of dislocation resulting, to me, they result from the transformation itself. It should be a new study, and it's to transform this rotation field we can measure in EBSD into geometrically necessary dislocation. People do that. I mean, I forgot the name. It was done maybe 10 years ago. It started to explain how you can use your EBSD map to extract the density of geometrically necessary dislocation. So I think that we could do the same here. And then we can try to establish a link between the distortion matrix and this density of GND. But it's to be done. I mean, I didn't. It's an open work to me.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think our colleague Dr. Ben Britton and with a lot of members in the team have done a lot of works on using EBSD to quantify necessary dislocations. But yeah, that's very interesting work. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I was, yes. I know, Ben. Yeah. I was trying to remember another name. Because at that time, 10 years ago, or 15 maybe, they just wanted the GND, even if it's plastic. I mean, what can be done in your lab is to extract both the plastic and elastic, the whole part of the distortion. So it's even better if you can have both all the components of the rotation field and the distortion field. That's even better, of course. But okay, it's something to be done, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, any other questions? No? Okay, so if you have any further questions, just email, like we can find. I think all of you received emails of Dr. Karen, so you can drop him an email. And I think it's really nice work. It's like give us some insights to challenge the established theories and to based on our experiments. And that's very important. So thank you, Dr. Karen, for your wonderful talk.
Thank you very much again for the invitation. Thank you.
No problem at all. Thank you. Okay, guys. So we will thanks for everyone for coming, and we will send up another invitation for our next seminar with Jessica as well. So thank you, Jessica, as well, for organizing a lot of this. All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye.